Hi, everybody. I'm Marilyn, CEO and founder of Cosmic Centaurs, and the host of our weekly live video series, Center Stage. We're in the middle of our second season, dedicated to the magic of teams, where we're exploring what makes teams cohesive, high-performing, and happy. As you may know, if you've been with us since the beginning of the season, we have distributed this season over 4 chapters to better understand the magic of teams. And our first chapter was all about team dynamics. And this second chapter is all about how to build great teams. And as you know, at the end of every chapter, I come on here solo just to kind of recap everything that we've learned from our various guests. And in this chapter, we learned about how to build diverse and inclusive teams. We learned about how to recruit the right talent. We learned about how to engage with, fresh grads, but also how to create great remote teams. And so before we begin, I will be sharing all of the insights and the learnings from our 4 episodes, but please do show us some love. Give this video a like, of course. Share your thoughts. I'm here. I can read your comments and answer your questions if you have any. We'll be together for about 30 minutes, and I can always come back later and answer your questions there. So let's start. This chapter, we had 4 different guests. We had Jonathan Yeo, who spoke about diversity and inclusion and equity in teams. We had Sonal Bal, who shared with us how to effectively recruit team members based on skill and cultures. We also talked to Saima about recruiting fresh grads, Saima Siddiqui, and Chase Warrington about how to build great remote-first teams. I'll also, of course, intertwine our learnings with some of my own experience and stories. So let's get started. Jonathan, who's the founder of the Potential Space, was in our first episode of this chapter, and he taught us a lot about diversity and inclusion in teams. We wanted to kind of, when we were thinking about this chapter, when you go online and you say how to build great teams, a lot of the answers that you get are around how to take a team that's there and how to make it great. But we wanted to go back to the fundamentals. Like, if you were given a blank slate, how would you want to think about putting together your team of Avengers, which is not something you'll find a common answer for. And I think a great place to start with was this question of diversity and inclusion. Of course, the pandemic has brought a lot of questions around how we make sure that we create diverse spaces, not just in our physical offices, but also for people working remotely, and the discrepancy between the different populations and minorities in different countries and how they've addressed this world. And I think we are firm believers, of course, in the importance of diversity in teams and how much that can bring to their ability to be resilient and innovative and performing. And so that's why we chose to have Jonathan come and talk to us first. And something that was really interesting about how he spoke to us about diversity is, like, we tend to think, diversity is an end goal. We're going to put some KPI. We're going to say this is how we measure diversity in this company, and that's what we're going to work towards. But what was really beautiful about the way that he approaches this is that diversity and inclusion is more than just like ticking a box, doing one training, a workshop. It's an ongoing process, and every organization needs to continuously prioritize inclusion rather than simply focus on quotas or end goals. And one of the ways in which Jonathan, encourages us to put inclusion on the agenda is that it's really about getting people to talk about who they are. That's kind of the space you want to create to make sure that everybody's individuality is brought to the table. When we had Dr. Vinika on in the Cosmic Conference back in July, she made a really beautiful point about the fact that we often tend to look at diversity as visible, inherent diversity, things like ethnicity or race or gender or age. But she also brought in acquired diversity, which is coming more from experience and background and kind of individual narratives. Of course, that's more difficult to measure, but it's equally important to take into account. And that's where Jonathan's advice about creating space for people to share about who they are is a really important one. He highlighted a simple example of how teams can be inclusive. For example, hosting an activity where each participant can share how they are not like the stereotype that go with the boxes that they're in. For example, I'm a woman, I'm Lebanese Canadian, I live in Dubai. Each one of these different labels carries its own stereotypes. And actually, funny enough, one of our interns, one of our ex-Centaurs, Billy, hosted an activity just like that when he joined the company here. He had us answer a questionnaire that would help us kind of measure ourselves across different dimensions and then compared us to our national stereotype. And it was really fascinating to see the ways in which we do or don't collate with those labels and stereotype. So that's an example of an activity that he brought up. And that really kind of reminded us that what matters is really looking at the stories and the individuals and not just looking at the labels. Another really important takeaway from this episode was that what matters more, and again, this goes back to this idea of it's an ongoing process, is to think more about how we can be more diverse, more being the operative word here, rather than fixating on what is the level of diversity that we're trying to achieve. I recently spoke to someone who works for an American company, but in their Copenhagen office. They themselves are American. But they were saying how, for example, the directive from HQ was to hire more Latinx, which works quite well, of course, in the US. It makes a lot of sense, but there's not a lot of Latinx in Copenhagen. And so rather than focus on these, blanket goals, I think the advice that Jonathan gave about how do you become more diverse rather than how do you have like a token of diversity is really, really important. Especially, like I said, in places where that measure doesn't quite work out very well, or in really small teams where it's difficult to make sure everybody's represented. I see a quick question here from Marie. She says, what according to you is the most difficult aspect of building a team? Do you have an hour? I mean, there are so many difficult aspects, but I think one of the ones that I found, especially like in a company, like let's say of our size where it's young, so the company is the team, right? It's not sat within a broader scope, is you in the early days of creating a team, whoever's leading that team, if they have the choice of who they're going to recruit, it's very easy to fall into the trap of recruiting people who are like you, right? You're going to work well together. You don't have to re-explain the universe to them. It's easy, it's simple, it just works. And I think one of the most difficult aspects is making sure you don't fall into that trap and making sure you don't only surround yourself with people who will naturally agree or work in the same ways. And that's why we actually chose to start with Jonathan in this chapter, because it's really about, having a broad view on who you want to include and what they bring to the team. And at some point, the more you can hire people who are different from you as an individual, the better. But of course, there's always this question of culture fit and culture add. And actually, that's one of the other points that Jonathan made that was really, really, insightful, was this idea of rather than always, we hear this a lot, hire for culture fit, rather than focusing on that, how about we focus on culture add, meaning what this individual can bring to the table. Of course, that doesn't mean that we hire people that hate our purpose, don't agree with our values, have nothing in common with us, but more that we seek out diversity quite openly, and that we don't default to just being surrounded by people who are the same. And that actually brings us to our second episode, recruiting for culture fit or culture set, or skill set with Sonal Baal. And in this episode, we invited Sonal, who's a career strategist and founder of Supercharge, who was also a speaker in our first ever Cosmic Conference, to come and share her truly contagious energy for an episode of Center Stage. And we asked her to come and talk to us about, if you kind of know what your Avengers team is going to look like, how do you make sure you're recruiting them well, and what's a good process for recruiting people, and what's the right balance to find between that culture piece and the skills piece, because that's always a difficult balance. And I think we can summarize her stance on hiring for cultures and skills with this simple quote from her. She said, hire for attitude and train for skill, right? What she meant by that is that lots of skills can be taught on the job. No need to, it's pointless to try and go and find someone who already knows how to do all of the things that this job might require. What matters more is the energy and drive for the job that applicants have, and that we make sure that we measure for that rather than trying to find someone who's going to tick all the boxes, which is a bit unrealistic and perhaps a little outdated in terms of how we recruit. Her point was that balance in recruiting is everything. And so balance both in terms of how you look at culture versus skills, but also balance in terms of the interview process. We talked a lot about these interview processes that end up having like 12 rounds of interviews where by the time you get to it, it's really survival of the fittest, not necessarily the best matching. And while of course you don't want to just hire with one interview, I think this idea of striking balance in your process is really, really important, making sure that you really give candidates a chance to shine in different settings. We talked about assignments, we talked about asynchronous stuff, and creating the right process to find the right candidates. And so we did talk, of course, a lot about how to make sure that you integrate culture in the way that you recruit. It's also important for the applicant to see if the company they're joining sounds like a place they want to be in. Interviews are not a one-way process. I think a company is interviewing a candidate, but in equal amounts, a candidate should be interviewing the company to see if that's where they want to bring their energy every day. And so that's really something that we discussed. And one of the ways that Sonal recommended that can be looked at in terms of making sure that this is the right fit for both is that you want to look at how applicants respond in certain situations. Because when it comes to like the typical interview questions, her point of view, and I think I agree, is like, in principle, a good candidate has come prepared. It's not like they don't know how to answer the questions you're about to ask. But it's more about seeing how they would respond in certain situations. And one of the tips that she gave us is that one way to hire someone by looking at their values is to ask behavioral questions. For example, ask them what was their opinion on something that happened recently in the news. It's a lot harder for them to prepare, a less genuine answer to that question. And that's a great way to get like an honest perspective. Anwar asked me a question here. How much, resources aside, how much experience should one have before trying to build their own team from scratch? That's a really great one. I'm going to get back to it just in a second. Let me just wrap up some of the things we learned from Sonal. Just to keep on that kind of values train. The other thing is, of course, if you're going to require potential team members to share values with you in your organization, then you need to have a clear idea of what your own values are first. It means that you've documented them, that you know how they integrate into your team life and company life. And that's not something that a lot of companies have. And so just a small tip for you guys, we actually wrote a 3-part article series about the different steps that you need to take in order to be able to document your organizational values. We'll plug it into the comments. Go ahead and give it a read. For example, the way that I integrate values in interviews is that I tell candidates about our values and ask them to tell me about instances where they expressed those values, or also just to react to them. Amazon has something, of course, more stringent, but similar in their process. So to go back to Anwar's question, how much experience should one have before trying to build their own team from scratch? I think that's a really difficult one. We've seen a lot of young entrepreneurs, they're like in their 20s, maybe they're barely out of college, be able to build really successful, high-performing teams and build beautiful success stories. And then sometimes you get it wrong quite a few times before you get it right. So I think as with everything, be mindful. Be very kind of an exercise that one of my mentors has given me when it comes to recruiting is write down what you want in the person. We tend to do that, like, job description, role, this is what we're going to be responsible for, and so on. But also write down what you don't want in that person. Write down anything that, even if that person was 2000% matched to your kind of job description, you would still walk away from them because you don't think that they'll, have added value to the team. And remember, you're assembling a team, not just a group of really high-performing individuals. So I don't know. The Avenger sounds like a great metaphor to me, but everybody's going to be unique and different. It's how they come together and how their superpowers, complement each other. Let's continue. I want to now jump forward to our fourth episode, which was with Saima Siddiqui, where we talked about hiring fresh grads. The reason I'm doing this fast forward, I'll come back to Chase Warrington's episode in a minute, is I just think we're staying on this recruitment train, and also talking about recruiting people who may not have any skills when they first join your company, or do they? So Saima Siddiqui is the CEO and co-founder of Grad Greenhouse. They're a market innovator for virtual recruitment, admissions, and engagement, for fresh grads, of course. And she came on to share with us why fresh grads can be a great fit for teams these days. I think the first point she made that was, really resonated with me, especially considering what Cosmic Centaurs does, is that as organizations are trying to adapt to flexible work models and leaders are trying to figure out how to get people engaged. There's, talks of the great resignation. There's so much changing around us, so much technology getting in the way of our human interactions. Her point, fresh grads, especially those who have just graduated, they've been working and going to university and doing group work and finishing exams and whatever it is that their university life brought to them, online for the last 2 years. They haven't gone to university, so they've learned quite a bit about how to make it work. So they can definitely be a source of great learning, even just with regards to adapting to flexible work models. And leaders should be open to that. But besides that, I think, Saima and I had a great conversation. My entire career, even I've been in companies, and I've always believed in the power of hiring fresh grads. And always just been in awe of what a 21-year-old with a lot of ambition can get done and learn, and how fast they can learn. And I think we both agreed on that. What's also beautiful about this generation is how value driven everybody is, and how much diversity and inclusivity, means to them, and how much they take those issues to heart. I think Jonathan in our first episode also made a similar point. And so I think in terms of both helping us adapt to the new world, but keeping us in check about our values, about our diversity and inclusion initiatives, or all the other issues that this generation is that they find close to their heart. I think it's good to have this kind of pressure from within the team. We did talk with Saima also about teaching fresh grads new skills. I think what matters is that you create a learning environment. And it's not, again, must not think about this as a one-way relationship. I think, for sure, fresh grads have a lot to learn about how a certain company operates, or the methodologies or the principles that they, work with. But I think creating a learning environment that goes both ways is really, really important. Showing any team member, honestly, fresh grad or not, that you can both help them grow, but also that you grow from their feedback is so important. And that's actually a really interesting point that Saima made, where she said, especially if you're hiring fresh grads who are top performers in their class, the way that the education system is set up is that if you're a top performer, you tend to be great at answering questions, not necessarily great at asking them. And so there's a bit of unlearning for them in this environment, where they still want to be high performers, but now they have to do it through a very different means. And so there's a bit of a steep learning curve for them to become mindful of that. They're used to being rewarded for answering questions, and now they have to reprogram themselves to become great question askers, not answerers. And, we had quite a fun conversation with our team, after this episode. I think it really resonated with all of us, because it said so much about what we're experiencing. Half of our team is fresh grads. And we made a promise to share this episode with all future hires, not just fresh grads, when they join, so that they could see, what their experience is going to be like. And so I'm going to look at a few questions here from the audience. Let's see. So Daniela asks, what have you learned from building Cosmic Centaurs? Again, how much time do you have? No, I think like what I've learned in building this team is that first of all, we were given an opportunity to build a team where it didn't matter where people were sitting, where they were from. We've had some of us are very close culturally to each other. You know, many of us are female, many of us are Middle Eastern, but we've also had the opportunity to include people from very different cultures in different locations in Europe and both Western and Eastern. And I think that first I've learned that this idea that we need to have some kind of shared layer of culture, whatever, is truly irrelevant. I'd already started experiencing that in my first job at Keyword, but it was really solidified here that you can build a global team from day one and you can find ways to include them. I think we'll talk a little bit about it when I recap the lessons from the episode with Chase. It doesn't matter. Of course, it can be easier if we're all together, but we can still build a great experience for our teams, even if we're not same. You know, I think Tala always she likes this sentence. She says alignment doesn't mean sameness. I think we discussed that once, and she likes to bring it up, and I think that's a really great kind of way of putting it. Alignment doesn't mean sameness. It's just about how we make sure that we all know where we're heading, which values we use along the way, and then just bring really smart, motivated people to get it done. Another question here from the audience, Rhea asks, in each episode you've asked what your guests' favorite rituals are. We'd love to know what yours are. What rituals have you experienced that has strengthened teams you've been a part of? Okay, so one of my favorite rituals, I don't know if it strengthens teams, but I think definitely it's just a really for me, a really energizing one is before important meetings or workshops, we always listen to Cosmic Girl from Jamiroquai on the Zoom call, before the participants or the clients joined. And I just love that. I think reminding ourselves of being lighthearted and, not taking ourselves too seriously is always a good thing. I think that my other favorite one is really when we get to talk. I mean, we have a dedicated team time, usually once every 3 to 4 weeks, where we all come together. It's never about work. We've done a lot of different things during those times, whether it's play Pictionary, answer questions from our Cosmic Conversations game, take the test that I was talking about earlier that Billy gave us about our national cliches. Whatever it was, I think dedicating time for connecting with each other, those are the rituals that I love. And I think also, this might be a less popular opinion, but we have rituals that are more about the health of the business. For example, we all come together as a team once a month to review all of our KPIs, and we never miss that. We look at our revenue, our margin, our marketing funnel, our sales funnel, how we're performing, our project-based accounting. And yeah, it's maybe less of like the beautiful social rituals, but I think it's equally important in indicating what matters. And in this case, it matters to us to build a healthy, sustainable, financially sustainable organization, and everybody has a part to contribute to that. So I think I like rituals that are both, on the performance and on the engagement side. There's a really great kind of Forbes research piece that we cited in our holiday article about how to run great performance management. And I think managers that focus on both the performance and the engagement end up getting the best results. And so for me, I love the mix of rituals that are on the one hand about engaging together and on the other about managing the performance of the organization, because in the end, it's that thing that brings us all together and it needs to survive for us to stay together. And that brings me to my conversation with Chase. So Chase Warrington, head of remote at Doist. We asked him to join us to talk about how you set up remote first teams, right? How you make sure they're successful, how you use, all the tools of asynchronous communication and all the other ways in which you engage with one another when you are remote. Because that's such a big element of bringing teams together these days. Most teams will end up being remote. And remember in the beginning of the episode, I said, you will not find a lot about how to assemble the team, but you'll find quite a bit about how to manage the team. And I think that's what we wanted Chase to share with us is like, okay, so once you've found this talent, it's diverse, it's aligned, it's a culture add. You've brought in a few fresh grads for their new ideas and created a learning environment. Great, but how do you do this all in a remote first setup? Having myself, as I mentioned earlier, built a remote first team in the pandemic, we had so much in common in terms of how to do that. For example, this need for leaders to be really, really intentional about activities in the team, about creating space for connection. We always say this at Cosmic Connected teams are happy teams, and we're actually conducting research to prove that. But I think even from just practitioner feedback and talking to other peers, it's such a topic. It always comes back. And of course, building a remote first team, these are some of the lessons we got from Chase. One of the things you have to do is you have to make sure that everything is explicit. Everything has to be said out loud whenever possible. There's always tacit knowledge in an organization that's difficult to document, but what can be documented should be. And this kind of intentionality has to start from the top. If you want team members to kind of work with these hygiene rules, be explicit about getting to know each other, take time, et cetera, then leaders have to prioritize those activities as part of the workday. They cannot be an afterthought, because most people will just prioritize getting their work done so they can move on. So it should become part of your workday that you spend time getting to know each other. And of course, for those of you who know how remote first teams operate, is they really rely heavily on asynchronous work. So asynchronous work is essentially no video calls, no phone calls, no live chatting. Everything is that if I share something with you, I have no expectation that you will respond to me in a synchronous manner. The reason for that, of course, is that the more spread out you are as a remote first team, the less this overlap is possible. You have to figure out another way to do it. We talked a lot with Chase about the rituals and the different ways in which he manages the team at Doist. And of course, we know there is no one size fits all. You have to take into account your culture, your team, how spread out you are. One debate that we had with Chase is our team relies quite a bit on daily stand-ups, and we use it to learn from each other, to make sure we're aligned, to connect, to have fun, to keep each other company. And he's completely against it. So I think every different team can find the right balance for them. I advise you to look at two resources on our website. One is our remote work manifesto, where we kind of tell you what you should prioritize. And the other is a worksheet that we created to help you look at how you communicate with each other as a remote team and make sure that your communication guidelines and tools are shared and that everybody knows how to use them. And so with that, that brings me to the end of our special episode. I see Rania asked the question here, how you can engage an introvert who'd never express or share their weakness or uncertainties in a team. So actually, Rania, we also did write an article about introverts and extroverts in remote setups. And I think, look, introverts are equally capable of assessing their own needs and sharing their emotions. I think, as with everything, it's about role modeling first, meaning as a leader, you share first. You put yourself out there. You are vulnerable in front of them first. And then you make sure that you're intentional about creating space for them without overwhelming them or making them feel like they have to share anything with you. Just ask, how are you doing today? You don't seem yourself. Do you want to talk about it? Leave space for them to say no, but I think that creating that space is important. Maybe for introverts, make it asynchronous. Maybe they don't want to be in a meeting telling you how they feel. Maybe there's a different way for them to contribute. The team will link the article for you. There's a few insights there as well that you can look at. And with that, I have to wrap up our episode. I'm always humbled by our incredible guests and their willingness to share their insights and expertise with us and our community. And I'm truly grateful for each of them. I'm also very grateful to each of you who has tuned in today or for any of our episodes. Can't believe we're halfway through the second season. I hope you've learned with us in the first and second chapter, and I hope you stick around for chapter 3 and 4, where we'll be next focusing on how to coach teams. As always, the video is available on our social pages, on YouTube, on our website. You heard me mention quite a bit of content. Our team always posts articles on our website, cosmiccenters.com. Do go there, sign up for the newsletter, read our content. It would make us incredibly happy. And then one last thing before I wrap this up. Next Thursday on January 27th, same time as today, we'll be airing an upcoming webinar about the metaverse and the future of work as our center stage episode. So the webinar is actually taking place on Wednesday, January 26th. We'll put in the link for you if you want to register and attend it live. And then if you miss the live, you'll be able to join myself and Nuruddin Aboud, who's the CEO of Nova Quark, a metaverse company, and Augustine Chavez, an academic and architect, to talk about how the metaverse is going to influence the future of work. So if you miss the live, you can always tune in next Thursday, same time as our usual center stage episodes, to rewatch our play. And with that, comes to the end of today's episode. Thank you so much for sticking around, and I'll see you next time.